Noah built the ark out of gopher wood. The flood it came and the ark it stood. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. And Noah's ark's a moving, a moving along. Who built the ark? Now who built the ark? Oh, Noah, my Lord. Noah's ark's a moving, a moving, a moving. Noah's ark's a moving along. He marched the animals 2 by 2, the hippopotamus and the kangaroo.
I'm Chris Breslin.
And I'm Liz Vice.
And this is RTN Theology number 30. On today's conversation, we hosted D.L. Mayfield, who is an author and activist in Portland, Oregon. And having never personally been to Portland, Oregon, I was really excited to be joined by Liz on this episode. And they got into talking about their stomping grounds a little bit.
Yeah, it was awesome to hear another person's perspective, because Portland definitely does have a persona as a very progressive city and a very dark city. But the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm thankful that I got to grow up here. The food is incredible, so I need you to come and visit, Chris, with your family.
I'm
but
there.
It was here to just hear Danielle speak about her experience and to hear it from a perspective of a Christian who loves Jesus and knows theology, with the agenda of love, truly in a non-hippieist way of saying things, but the agenda of love.
Yeah, I've long admired some of what Danielle has written and also just kind of her voice on social media, especially a voice for her neighbors. Her and her husband have lived amongst refugees, both in Portland and in Minneapolis, and I just think she's a fantastic Christian voice that we need to be listening to, and kind of a way to understand some of the signs of our times when we look at the newspaper and we just see protest and unrest and try to understand how that interacts with and is included in our faith. So I think that was in our conversation. I was excited about it.
Yeah, I need to go buy her book so I can read it.
And throughout the episode, we're featuring some awesome music from Common Hymnal. Some of these songs, man, they're getting played in our house like crazy. The Cross That Made a Change is my son Simeon's jam. That's it. But so I'm really excited to include this music from some awesome songwriters and just a real collective, collaborative group of some awesome Christian music these days.
That's cool. Yeah.
Hope you enjoy.
When they saw Jesus, they saw a teenage mother. They saw an unbelieving brother, just a man in poverty. But when I see Jesus, I see the sovereign and the Savior. I see the healer of the nations. I see the stone rolled away. And nobody thought that this son of sorrow would be broken for love to fix our tomorrows. But it's the cross that made the change. It's the cross that made the change. Now let everybody know that it's the cross that made the change. It's the cross that made the change. It's the cross that made the change. Now let everybody know it's the cross that made the change. And when they saw Jesus, they saw a rebel and a problem. And they did everything to stop him. Yes, they did. Even put him on a tree. But when I see Jesus, I see the sovereign and the Savior. I see the healer of the nations. I see the glory from Galilee. And nobody thought that this son of sorrows, hey, would be broken for love to fix our tomorrows. And when this road is the cross that made the change, it's the cross that made the change. Do you believe it? I'll let everybody know that it's the cross that made the change. It's the cross that made the change. It's the cross that made the change. And I'll let everybody know that it's the cross that made the change. Now when we see Jesus, we become like Jesus. Y'all know this, come on. When we know how he sees us, we will never be the same. Come on, sing it with me. Now when we see Jesus, all right, we become like Jesus. When we know how he sees us.
We're here with Danielle Mayfield, author of The Myth of the American Dream, Reflections on Affluence, Autonomy, Safety, and Power. Thanks for being with us today, Danielle. So you wrote this book, from what I can read, about paying attention and being fully alive in your place. I think that's what it says early on in the book. So boiled down to the smallest unit, this place feels like your city, your neighborhood, your block. Tell us a little bit about your place and your neighbors.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. And I think I really wanted to write some essays that explored some really big themes that I have seen coming up over and over again as someone who grew up a white American evangelical and then trying to live like Jesus Christ and finding a lot of places of tension and places where these two parts of my life seem to diverge. And so as someone who didn't really grow up believing in systemic sin and I was really focused on like individual sin and stuff, I decided, okay, let's do some essays where we do go to that really small granular level, start to pay attention to where you live, where you eat, where you worship, where you send your kids to school, like how you got your mortgage, all that stuff, to start to pay attention to that. And then we will start to learn more about the systems at play in our world. And so for me, it's not just about paying attention. I think like poets and artists do that really well. For me, I'm kind of saying, as someone who comes from a more privileged background, I want to learn how to pay attention to inequality and to make sure I stay laser focused on that instead of explaining it away, instead of burying my head in the sand, but really pay attention to inequality and ask myself every day, am I okay with this? Am I okay living in a world where God's dream for the world has not happened for so many of my neighbors? And as a Christian, I think the answer is, for someone like me, like, no, I'm not supposed to be okay. And I think that's a little bit at odds with maybe some concepts we have about faith, which is you're always supposed to be joyful. You're always supposed to say God's in control. And while I believe in this loving, incredible, creative, generous God, I believe like through the life and witness of Jesus, we're supposed to be a part of actually bringing God's kingdom here and now. And if we pay attention, we'll start to see places where that's not happening. And we can start to ask, like, how can I be a part of that? And so that's a long-winded response to your question, but I did want to tackle some of these really big themes that drive people like myself from a more dominant culture privileged position, and that we've sort of baptized as maybe inherently good or Christian values, and say, sometimes these can be actually really harmful to our neighbors. So yeah, that's kind of what it's about.
You and your husband came back to Portland, from what I understand. How is coming back specifically to Portland kind of did it change the way you saw the place after being other places?
Yeah, I guess for all that, I didn't even talk about the fact of where I live now, which is Portland. And I'm someone who grew up in a bunch of places growing up. Like my family moved every 2 to 3 years, and it's mostly been on like the West Coast, but places like Alaska, Wyoming, just some real interesting spaces. But I've lived in Oregon longer than I've lived anywhere else. And now I would say Portland longer than anywhere. But yeah, for 3 years, my husband and I and our daughter moved to Minneapolis, where I worked with Somali refugees there. And then coming back to Portland, it was so shocking to see the lack of diversity in Portland. And, I think Portland is a place that really prides itself on being progressive and diverse and weird. And I was like, oh my gosh, y'all have nothing on the Midwest. And, I also started to see some really troubling things just as far as gentrification was seen like wholly as a really positive thing. There was little to no discussion about how extremely difficult it is for people in poverty to find a place to live in Portland. And so we ended up moving to the very outskirts of Portland to this neighborhood called Rockwood, where they do have more affordable housing as far as apartments go. And so that is where there's a high concentration of people in poverty and actually immigrants and refugees. But as a whole, it just really opened my eyes to sort of the danger of believing yourself to be diverse and progressive when actually your policies and systems and neighborhoods and schools are just as segregated and just as unequal as anywhere else. But it's almost kind of worse because you think you're awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's been my experience, but I'm so excited because Liz Vice is here today. And Liz, you're also somebody who's familiar with Portland. And I just really can't wait to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah. I mean, if you have specific questions, not only did I grow up in Northeast Portland, but I also went to private school, and my mom had to scrub toilets, single mom raising 5 kids on her own. Yeah, it was interesting to see, like the coffee shop that we went to off of Albina Street, up and down Mississippi and Albina was just like the projects. Mm-hmm. It was not a place that I ever wanted to go. Alberta was never a place that I ever wanted to go. And now it's like one of the most expensive areas in the Portland metro area. And it's so hip and it has all these restaurants. And I'm like, whoa, there used to just be like empty lots and fences everywhere. The first time I went into that coffee shop on Albina, I was like, where am I? I have never seen anything like this in my neighborhood. Mm. And now where my mom lives, even Deacon Street used to have so many gangs. And when I'd get on the 8 bus and it would stop at the park, I would pray, Jesus, please do not let this bus stop at the park, because there was so much violence there at night. And when it would, I would just run home just to make sure I stayed out of trouble, because my older brother had been beat up by a gang, and like, that was just the neighborhood, and being teased in private school. You live in Northeast Portland. It's so ghetto over there. But then I would go to LA and I'm like, I don't think these people have actually seen a ghetto, because this is kind of like the suburbs in comparison to most neighborhoods, but because of the reputation of Northeast Portland. Northeast Portland is so big that when you would see it on the news, it'd be like another shooting in Northeast Portland, but it was nowhere near where I lived, but I was always associated with the bad neighborhoods. Yeah, it's just been interesting. And I also think growing up as a Black woman here, people do talk racial injustices away. Like, that's not why they treated you that way. And if you're trained to believe that for 30 years of your life, why would I ever, how would you learn to tell the difference between, oh, they're just treating me this way because they're having a bad day, instead of, no, I'm being followed because I'm a Black woman. Mm-hmm. Or they did not acknowledge me when I stepped into the store because I didn't look like them. But I never really felt the freedom to say that until I moved to New York City.
Mm.
Like I never felt bold in saying they're treating me this way because I'm a Black woman. Because now I was around people who spoke up about racism. I was around, New York is still pretty segregated, no matter how diverse it is. To be in a market and be followed, like blatantly followed, you kind of learn like, nah, this is just because I'm Black. And then coming back to Portland and you seeing those things of like, whoa, I was so young when this pastor said that to me. You people and your rat's nest hair, you people and your attitudes on Monday morning. Like this is stuff that happened when I was 15, 16, and they echo through my mind all the time. If I speak up for injustices, if I speak up for like racial tension, it's not because I'm just carrying a race card and being too sensitive. It's like, no, I grew up having pastors say the most racist things that I didn't even realize was racist because that's not why I said it. But then to remember, oh, I remember when he said, this is why people shouldn't mix. People shouldn't date outside of their race. I remember when one of the Bible college teachers said, races are separate in heaven.
Oh my gosh.
That is so screwed up. And that's what I believed. I remember when people told me in my early 20s to mourn the fact that I would be single for the rest of my life because there were no Black men here. I remember not feeling beautiful ever because I was comparing myself to Patagonia bread making kinfolk women who all the men would want to chase because that's what they were told they desired. But then I moved away and you learn the vocabulary to describe what you've gone through, where it's like, it's not a race card. This is just what I went through. And you are so embarrassed by your ugly, you're trying to make me feel bad about feeling bad. This is not my issue. This is yours. But it took damn near like, I'm 37 years old. I moved from Portland 3.5 years ago. That's not that long.
You mentioned now having vocabulary to talk about race and in some of your kind of a way to organize some of your experiences and understand them now. It's interesting contrasted with something Danielle mentioned about some of her neighbors in Portland being kind of like, well, being a progressive city that has all these stated values, some of which they don't live up to, and often, and I've never been to Portland, sorry guys, but Durham is kind of like a Portland of the South, of the Bible Belt, right? If there's such a thing, but and so these are my neighbors too, who often have all the vocabulary to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about white progressives, have the vocabulary. And so I find it interesting that it's, for you, it has opened you up to, in some senses, understanding suffering that you couldn't understand, or like being able to understand those things as not your fault or coming from you, but put upon you. But it can kind of have the inverse effect for people of privilege to have some of that vocabulary, because it can kind of distance us or make us feel like we're better, or we're doing better.
And that's what makes all the protests so like, I'm your only Black friend, or I know you don't have Black friends. And it's not like maybe I didn't have the vocabulary, because I did grow up with a mom who grew up in LA who talk about the Watts riots and Rodney King and all these things that you hear in your home, but then you go to school and we weren't allowed. I went to private high school. We had Black History Day one time, and then they were like, "We no more." So I was never taught Black history in school. I knew about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass. I don't know if we really learned about Malcolm X. He might have been too much. But my mom would tell me about Josephine Baker, Black Panthers, brown paper bag parties where there's a lot of colorism in the Black community, that if your skin is darker than a paper bag, you can't go to these parties. My mom is very fair skinned. So you hear these stories at home from my grandmother when my uncle was dating a white woman, and the names that he would be called as he was walking down the street in LA or Mississippi or wherever. I think it was LA. Like, you just hear these stories at home. The Black movies. I grew up watching The Color Purple over and over and over. Karina. Like, you just grow up seeing Bill Cosby. Growing up watching these shows where Black television in the 90s was so incredible. And I'm so thankful I got to grow up with shows like Living Single, where it was 4 Black women who, one was a lawyer, one was like the creator of a magazine that wanted to diversify and like tell stories of inner city New York. And I loved it. And that's what I got to see. But then when you go into these Christian spaces, it was very white, very, let's go to the DR to build a home, but you don't actually have relationships with people in your own backyard.
So that's interesting. I would love to hear. Like, I think it's really helpful to kind of focus on Portland, not because Portland is necessarily special or spectacular, but kind of what you're doing in your book, Danielle, is like you focus on a place to see the world, right? And so I'd be curious from each of your distant past or even more recent past experience of church in Portland, because as someone who's only lived in the South, Portland is often held up as like the frontier, right? Like, and that's a nice way of putting it. Sometimes it's like that godforsaken place where we need to send missionaries and church planners, and like Christina Cleveland called it like church plantation planters, right? So I'm fascinated as a church person. What is church like, good, bad, and ugly, in a place like that?
Danielle, would you like to go first?
Oh, no, I don't. I'll just say that I'm someone who, coming more from like a lay person, a busybody, Christian do-gooder, I went to Bible college in Portland, Oregon. I have tried to evangelize many people in Portland and just failed miserably. And now I'm just trying to be a good neighbor in Portland. And I always, always, always am wishing for brothers and sisters from the church to join me.
Mm.
And I always end up feeling so incredibly lonely. Like, I feel like I'm going to cry right now, just being honest about that. Just the reasons I love Jesus, the reasons I stay a Christian, like, these are the reasons I do everything in my life, which includes being involved in the Portland protests. That involves, like, just a few days ago, I was actually protesting a large group of Christians worshiping downtown
Yeah.
because I'm a Christian. And, there was like 12 to 15 of us there saying, like, as Christians, we're inviting people to stop worshiping and praising God without mass for 1 second, to just kind of listen to the cries of people that have been going on in Portland. Um, and that's just a really hard feeling, because I want people to pray with me for justice, for God's dream for the world. And instead, usually I have people in my life who want to pray away the realities of the world, and I'm not interested in that.
Mm.
And so I think I've been on this journey of saying, I'm not giving up this Jesus thing. I just really hope I find some people. We now attend a church where there's definitely people who are involved in certain issues, but I think my dream goes back to the vision of the early church, where it's like so centered in a specific neighborhood.
Mhm.
Like, and before, COVID-19, like we were driving like 30 minutes to attend this church that aligns with us theologically. And that's the farthest I drive for anything. Everything in my life is hyper local. I'm obsessed with my neighbors in my neighborhood. And yet to worship God, I have to drive 30 minutes away. Uh, it just, I'm not okay with that. And so as much as I really love our church, I'm still really sad that there isn't more of what I still am seeking, which is I want people to live in my neighborhood with me. I want them to send their kids to school with my kids, and I want us to meet weekly for prayer. I want this to be the whole shebang. And instead, my neighborhood and my neighbors are amazing, but the vast majority of people I'm close with are Muslims. And so that's been kind of interesting to find a lot of solidarity in my life and our life together with Muslims. Looking back even at like Multnomah Bible College, right? Training pastors and me as a missionary and all this stuff. It wasn't that long ago I was there. I mean, maybe it is 15 years. I don't know, 14 years. But, I can't think of a single like Bible or theology syllabus that wasn't only made up of white men.
Yeah.
And so looking back now, I'm horrified. But again, back then, I was like, this is just the only people who got it right, I guess. And so stuff like that is still really disturbing to me. And I understand this is part of my life's work as being someone who is white growing up in Portland, to say, I will have to be on a continual journey of begging God to bring in other people, other diverse people, to show me the truth of who God is, because man, me and my people do not have a handle on it at all.
And blessed are the ones who walk in kindness, even in the face of great abuse. And blessed are the deeds that go unnoticed, serving with unguarded gratitude. And blessed are the ones who fight for justice, longing for the common day of peace. Blessed is the soul that thirsts for righteousness, welcoming the last, the lost, the least. The kingdom is yours.
Early in your book, you said something that stuck out to me. You said neighbors change us if we let them, and I feel like that stuck out because that feels like the difference in the logic of like the missionary and the logic of the person doing neighborhood ministry is like the evangelism in kind of traditional evangelical ways is like this unilateral thing where you don't want your neighbors to change you, but you definitely want to change your neighbors. And so Yeah, it feels like you're describing a more kind of mutual um, understanding of what living in and bearing the good news is, where you're not afraid to be changed, and maybe you affect some change on your neighbors. How did that change happen for you?
Yeah, I think that the first book I wrote was called Assimilate or Go Home: Notes from a Failed Missionary on Rediscovering Faith, and it really is about me coming to terms with this savior complex that was ingrained in me from birth. And it's actually much more insidious than just like a singular white savior narrative. It's actually this whole idea that white American Protestant evangelicals are at the pinnacle of God's like revelation for the world, and actually deserve to be in power because they have it all figured out. And it's also our job to convert everyone to believe just like us. And so this, has legacies from the founding of the Constitution, which only gave rights to white landowning males, right? That's God ordained. And then it goes back to, right, slavery. Like, why can we keep doing slavery? Is because we're actually going to convert these people as we bring them to our land. All this stuff, it's so much more insidious than an individual problem, like maybe me going and converting people. It's much bigger than that. And so the way I look at it, that kind of makes me laugh, is like, I was 19 going to Multnomah, learning all this stuff. And everyone around me is like, yes, you have everything about God figured out. Go for it. Go. Like, it just makes me want to laugh hysterically now to think that you could have that amount of hubris, right? I'm much more like, I am trying to love God. If you're trying to love God, like, come join me. Let's do this. And that's how I approach my Muslim neighbors. That's how I approach my evangelical Christian neighbors, because honestly, I feel like sometimes we were talking about a completely separate God anyways. And so I just have to say, like, I don't have a handle on this. I'm really inspired and encouraged by a global witness of the church and a historical witness of the church. But for me, I am trying to be a witness to how God is already at work in the world. And instead of saying I'm going to be the one to bring God, I just get to be this tiny, tiny part of what God is actually doing. And it takes all the pressure off of me, it takes all the savior complexes off me. I'm just this tiny little person, and I get to be a part of God's dream. And his dream is so good. It's so much better than this dream I was given. And I think that's kind of a central grief I wrestle with, is white evangelical American Christians, your dream is too small. It's way too small. And it's been absolutely corrupted by this desire for power. And so we got to do something drastic. I mean, Liz, you said before we were recording possibly that you said you think American Christianity is kind of at this busting point, right? And I see that too. And I see how this desire for power, for me, I don't know, seems pretty central to it. But I'm curious.
And I don't think it's as scary as I've heard it from the pulpit taught, of like, oh, they're going to take over Christianity and you're going to be persecuted and you're going to have to memorize these things so that if someone asks you to deny God, this is what you're supposed to say. And are you willing to lose your life? And yeah, that's not what I've discovered. And I think touring and doing music and going into venues and singing in places that aren't Christian, aren't religious spaces, where I felt like Jesus was saying, I love these people too. I'm not asking you to save them. I just want you to sing over them. And I also have to go back to, okay, so I went to private school and these were my experiences, but the church community that I started in was led by a Black pastor from North Carolina, Elizabeth, North Carolina. And
Elizabeth City, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Up on the coast. Yeah.
And he always would talk about it. And he was really good about bringing inner city youth to the beach to go camping, where they had a space to talk about their upbringing. And a lot of these kids had some horrific homes that they were living in. And for 1 week, that was free, fed 3 meals a day, they had this safe space. We were also connected with a local Native American community in Toppenish, Washington. So there are people doing the work. I've just never seen it done main scale, like mainstream big churches, without the mentality of we're going to go into these communities and save them and clean them up and teach them how to be civilized. It was, we're gonna build relationships with these people and get to know their story and let the kids be kids, but also know that they are loved and they can be used for the Lord. But it was very different as I got older and spread my wings to go to different churches that would be considered more progressive. Yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot of some of what Dorothy Day says and writes, and it feels like Danielle really loves and admires Dorothy Day, and um, but there's that. It's subtle, but it is a drastic flip of bringing the gospel to the poor, or um, giving them or dispensing something onto them, and rather being met by Christ in the face of the poor. In a way, also, if you read enough Dorothy Day, you realize that she doesn't romanticize the poor either, which is something that I've found more and more as like um, when you start to get to know people, you realize that people are people and they're amazing and wonderful and miracles and crappy and grumpy also, um, but that's where we meet Christ. Yeah, it's a shame that is lonely work, rather than the dominant mode of ministry.
Yeah, I think I love that you just said it's lonely work, because honestly, a part of my sort of conversion story is the fact that I was trying to be a missionary. I started working with Somali refugees here in Portland. I actually moved into their apartment complex, like did the whole thing. And I felt so lonely because I was not able to share with my Christian community what was actually happening to me, which was I had been told I was going to bring Jesus with me into these spaces. And when I would go and sit on these couches and my neighbors would feed me, I would experience the love of God
Mm-hmm.
so strongly. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I can't tell anybody this. They would call me a heretic. They would say I'm wrong. Like it just raises up so many questions in their minds if I'm even a Christian anymore. And it wasn't until I read people like Dorothy Day that I was like, oh gosh, other people experience
That's
this.
what's
Like,
happening. Yeah, Matthew
yes, like
25 is happening. Yeah.
I'm experiencing the love of Jesus through my neighbors, right? And then going back and reading the scriptures, you're like, okay, that's a very common theme
Yeah.
in the Bible to
Yeah.
expect that. And it's something that's really horrifying that is not taught in my Bible college, to expect that. And that is white supremacy in my mind at work. This idea that you are at the pinnacle, your neighbors have nothing to teach you. You're not to
Mm.
expect God at work in the world. When I'm like, oh my gosh, Jesus was like, God's in all of these places. So my book is kind of centered around Jesus announcing his ministry in Luke 4, where he's drawing off of Isaiah 58, where he says, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are captives, to restore sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at how my Christian culture kind of, what spaces are they really telling us to pursue? Like,
Mm-hmm.
no, if you're doing it right, you will have a lot of money. If you're a good Christian, right? You have a good house, you have a good savings account, all that stuff. Does that sound like the poor that Jesus was saying would be blessed? No. Same thing with like people who are captive. Like everybody in my culture just wants to be free. They want their individual rights to own guns, to hold worship gatherings, to not wear a face mask. Like that's kind of this obsession most of my culture has, right? Same thing with this desire to be well and not experience suffering, to pursue safety, and then to pursue power. But Jesus is saying, like, I am here for those who have been oppressed. I'm not here to make you into oppressors, right? And yet somehow things have gotten so terribly, terribly backwards. And I just think it's all really coming to the surface, especially in these past couple months.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like in the Psalms where it says the dross from the impurities and the gold will come to the top and it'll be scraped off, and it's purification. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think we're seeing the rug lifted and what's been swept under for so long, for centuries and centuries, and it's going to be ugly. But I don't think this is bad. I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I think it's exciting too. It's just um it's hard to remember that it is such a like biblical scriptural thing, but
Mhm.
I was listening to, I think it was Dr. Yolanda Pierce was talking about one of the Hebrew words for prophet, one of the most common ones. It actually means to bubble up, like a
Mm,
boiling water, to just have what's been under the surface bubble up to the top. And I think you're exactly right. We're having to be confronted with what's really going on.
mhm.
That is good.
I mean, Jesus says, people will say in my name, you've done this, this, and this, but depart from me, for I never knew you. Don't separate the weeds from the wheat because they look so similar. God will do that. And you're like, I hope I'm wheat.
The blood of my brother was spilled on the street. He was the rose that grew out of the concrete. The same ground where his body lay, like rose petals on a stony grave. Why do we fear each other from the lies of yesterday? I'll never know. But look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They call this one my ground. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They call this one Trayvon Martin. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They call this one Tyshawn Lee. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. It's far too many for me. The tears of my mother were spilled at his grave. She knows the cost the whole world could not repay. And when she should have felt our sympathy, all we told her is that her baby was guilty. And do we even have compassion? Do we even want to see? I'll never know. But look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They called this one Freddie Gray. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They called this one Eric Gardner. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. They called this one Sandra Bland. I'm asking you to look at all these roses with petals on the ground. Every woman, every man.
And so some of this bubbling up has been happening in Portland. We see it on the news and various media coverages of ongoing protests and then also recent protests. So you were involved in two protests in the last month or so. Uh, I would just be curious, kind of with the eyes and the imagination that you're cultivating in your book of paying attention to what God is doing and where these things are bubbling up around you. What did you see at both of those events?
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about because things are so complex and there's so much going on, and we are in a global pandemic, and my neighbors are really suffering. And I felt pretty removed from most of the protests happening in Portland because that's all downtown and that feels like another world to me. None of my neighbors are protesting. They're very invested in staying alive and staying safe. So I just felt a little bit like, I don't think that's my place to go down there. And yet I did feel drawn to witness what seemed to be at this point a historic event happening with police brutality being revealed to be pretty much an epidemic. And then seeing there's some moms and a call for more moms to go down. Well, I'm very much a middle-aged white lady mom, so I was like, okay, I'll just go down.
Own it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's very much me. So I got my Tuesday night prayer group ladies, and we all went down and just got tear gassed the hell out of us, man. Just it was really interesting. And before that, I was just like, man, the atmosphere downtown really reminds me of like what was going on in Acts. Like there's just so much community. People are taking care of each other. There's people blowing bubbles. There's people who are experiencing, homelessness, grilling ribs for everybody. It was wild. And basically what we are chanting together is that Black Lives Matter. Police need to be held accountable for their brutality. And just to see the level of force that it was the federal agents by the time I was down there, but Portland police had been doing the same thing for a long time. And I had that experience another time. I went down 2 times to support the moms and the protesters, and just feeling this huge sense of grief at the militarization of our police, of our country, and how we respond to people who are asking really hard questions. And it also had caused me to really rethink some things I have felt about what makes a good protester a bad protester, and what nonviolence really is. And that's one thing it's been great to learn, is we can all be different, and I can be a committed Christian and be committed to nonviolence, and that does not give me a right to police the way people who are suffering are responding in these moments. So that's been important for me to learn. But then recently we did go and protest a large worship gathering held very close to where all these protests have been happening. And, to bring Jesus through this dark city of Portland, and, to defy all these bans on Christians gathering in churches and worshiping together. So there's like 1,000 people, and I would say 5% were wearing masks. And they were also there, basically the hashtag was riots to revival. So they're characterizing these long-term protests against police brutality as riots. And then saying the antidote to that is a bunch of people, the vast majority of them white, singing in close quarters together about the love of Jesus, while delegitimizing the very real concerns that people had. And so we just went with some scripture verses about what God truly desires, which is justice and righteousness. And then that was like the most stressful 2 hours of my life, because I just had people screaming at my face for 2 hours, and they weren't wearing masks. That was awesome. And just, I'm not sure any of this is good that I'm doing this. I don't know what's the point. I don't know if this is helpful. I'm just a Christian trying to live out my faith as it's happening right now. And I want to, I guess some of my goal is to bear witness, right? So I've been trying to do that. And then with the group of triumphalistic Christians, I guess my other point was I just kind of wanted to confuse some people. Be like, this is not the only way to worship God right now. I actually view protests, and not just downtown ones. I take my kids to lots of local Black Lives Matter protests. And even my kids have really told me, like, when we get to march and we get to chant, it takes away our anger and our fear, because my kids, they see the names of all these people who've been killed by the police, in the past few years. And I have to tell them the story of each person. And my daughter will just start crying, and that's the appropriate response. But then as we march and as we chant, she's just like, oh my gosh, I know I'm not alone anymore. I feel sure like some change is going to happen. And she's like 9, and she can better articulate why. And Liz, you know this, why singing is important, why chanting is important, why movement gets us out of our body and out of fear. And so I think protest is a very natural form of prayer for me. And I would like to invite more Christians into maybe experiencing that. However, not protesting to be able to worship together in a large group during a pandemic. I think what we're protesting is kind of important as for what makes it prayer.
Yeah. So you've kind of talked around it, but to put a sharper point on it, what do you think church can learn from protest movements? like personally, I remember as a pastor of a neighborhood church being pretty frustrated. I remember in 2016, the Sunday after the election, a lot of our people were really upset. And it was one of the smallest church gatherings that we've ever had. And a lot of our people did go to a protest downtown that Sunday afternoon. And I remember being really disappointed, not that they went to a protest, sounds great, but that the protest for them was holding their emotions and their thoughts and where their heads and hearts were at better than our worship gathering and potluck in the morning, And so I think I'm becoming more and more open to, again, paying attention in what churches can learn from protest movements.
Yeah, I think the thing that keeps coming to my mind is that, dominant culture church in the United States does not have a background of lament. And yet lament is this really important part of the biblical tradition of interacting with God. In fact, lament psalms are 30% of the psalms. And yet, how often do we get to sing aloud our sorrow? And lament really is based in this idea that you are extremely honest with God about exactly what's going on in the world. And you ask God, where the heck are you? Do you see what's happening? Let me speak it as plain as it's actually happening. I don't need to sugarcoat it. And then most lament psalms do end with this recollection of how God has been faithful in the past, and you end on a hopeful note, but not all.
Yeah.
And so for me, these protests, like what we can learn is to listen to lament. It's very simple. And so maybe your parishioners did not feel like church would be a safe place for lament for them. And finding churches that are able to incorporate lament as a part of their liturgy is so important. And actually, I think liturgical prayer can operate like that often because we can join together, resting, knowing that other Christians are seeing what we're seeing and praying for God to intervene. There's been like the guy who came downtown and did worship here on Saturday. He had been showing pictures of like, oh, these Portland protesters, they're burning Bibles. They're burning Bibles downtown. And when I was downtown, there's an old guy down there giving people Bibles. So it could have just been really easy fodder because there's this guy shoving them at people the whole time. But I was like, maybe a few years ago, I would have been really freaked out by that. But now I'm like, if you're a Christian, wouldn't you want to ask yourselves why? Like, why is the Bible seen as siding with federal agents tear gassing them? Like, why can we just sit in the why? Can we just sit in the sorrow? And this is not an easy thing, but the more you practice it, it does actually become a part of your life to be able to hear someone's sorrow. And instead of, I think, Liz, you were even bringing this up earlier when you said people in Portland are not even able to hear you when you say, I have experienced racism. And it's something I've really had to learn myself is when people tell me their life is hard, that bad things have happened to them, I just need to listen, especially if they're people who come from more marginalized communities. And I think the church can do that too. And I have just been so encouraged by leaning into lament and viewing protests as a part of lament. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Liz?
You just look at the life of Christ. Yeah, he wasn't like protesting with his words, with signs, but he turned over tables because they turned God, a place of worship, into a place of capitalistic gain. He spoke to women, which is a protest against the normal traditions of women are dogs. This is a Samaritan woman. He made the enemy the hero. He said the kingdom of God, if you don't become like this nameless, genderless child that he randomly pulled from the crowd, if you don't become like this child, you will not be able to enter the kingdom of God. But that's what he says. He has to wear this kind of outfit. He has to say these kind of words. It was just like, you have to become like this child who doesn't matter in society. And I think that is something that I've had to learn as well. I've had bad experiences of racism, but I also feel like because of the character of Jesus, I don't know, his sheep knows his voice. And I'm like, this is what Jesus experienced. He was called a bastard in the Bible. He knows what it's like to be in the margins. And I relate to Jesus in that way. Um, but it also teaches you to listen, to hear other people's story. Why is that person so obsessed with power and pride? Oh, he grew up in a really horrible home, and that was ingrained in his mind, and he just never escaped it. He's enslaved to his own privilege. Um, yeah, but that's taken time. That's taken the willingness to see your own flaws, myself. Racial injustices haven't just happened from strangers, it's happened from close friends who just didn't realize what they were saying was hurtful because I never said anything to say that was hurtful because I never felt like I was allowed to. So it's like a vicious cycle. Um, but we're all learning. Being a human's really hard. And you just have to be willing to feel gross and ugly for a little while. Yeah.
Where have you felt some partnership in this? We've mentioned how this is lonely, but we also talked about like the Wall of Moms as being, a very kind of like almost like a performance art piece of companionship and your locked arms with bicycle helmets and a really beautiful way of physically putting your body in between force and people that you're hoping to protect. Where have you felt maybe not in as physical terms, maybe more just companionship, friendship, common goals? Where have you had friends in this work?
Yeah, I think what is hard right now is the isolation of COVID-19 and how it's affecting everybody. And so I've been pretty devastated because I love my neighborhood. I love my routines. I love my life here. I love teaching English classes. I love being really involved in our local school, and that's just all over. And trying to keep my neighbors safe when most of my friends are not super into technology, it's just been really devastating. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And there's a lot of complexities to like the Wall of Moms and all that stuff, but maybe one reason why protests have been a really important part of my life for the past few months is it is a way to be physically near people and to like my daughter experience say I'm not alone. And I've been thinking a lot about something I heard on TikTok, which is hilarious to me that I'm like, TikTok is teaching me this, but it totally is. This woman was talking about how capitalism really uses shame to isolate us into thinking we're the only ones experiencing certain things. We're the only ones failing at certain parts of
Mhm.
life. We're the only ones with terrible skin. And, we're the only ones who hate the way we look in these jeans. And I've just been thinking about that a lot about, um, not to get too like kooky, but how Satan wants us to feel isolated
Mhm.
from God's global kingdom at work, right? And so even for me, as I'm someone who I used to want to evangelize, my immigrant and refugee neighbors, and now I'm trying to evangelize white Christians. I still have that like missionary mindset, and I can feel a lot of shame sometimes
Mhm.
when um they feel confronted by me or I feel like I'm doing something wrong, or even within my own family there's real tensions, right? Like, why do you keep going after this? Just let people live, all that stuff. And I just think since we're already all feeling really physically isolated, it's probably good to pay attention to if we're feeling a little isolated by shame right now,
Yeah.
especially as there are so many like political and religious issues. Like, I mean, America is in a time of reckoning with our history of racial violence right now, you know, as we're all stuck in our homes trying
Mhm.
not to get COVID-19. And so for me, paying attention to the shame is important. And it's been hard, but I am trying to reach out to people who are specifically Christians who can walk through this with me as followers of Christ. As much as I love all these protesters down there doing the work night after night, I am doing what I do because of Jesus. And so I need to continue to find that. And what is cool, right, about this time is we do have access to social media. We can read diverse books. We can follow very diverse voices. We can attend Zoom church. It's a pretty different places than maybe we have access to in our physical neighborhood. So there's some really cool things we can actually utilize right now. Like, even Liz, listening to your music is really healing to me as I'm sort of coming to terms with some of the triumphalism of some more white evangelical charismatic power centered music, right, what I grew up with. And so finding worship music that I feel like is really speaking to the moment, it's been really amazing and been really, really cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing as well. It's not an easy task, and it also goes hand in hand with the mentality that Christians shouldn't suffer, because it gets messy. I mean, I always think Jesus was literally killed for the way he loved, for the people that he ate with. So it might not have to be a physical death that we experience as we try to fight for justice and peace. But it could be a social death. It could be a death of relationships between some of the closest people to you, blood. So it's going to be a long fight, but it is worth it because you're blessed by your neighbors. Like you're experiencing heaven on earth in a way that most people would never allow themselves to.
Yeah, I think this time has given me more kind of not sympathy, but kind of room for like the like yard sign activism, which normally I'm kind of annoyed by because it just doesn't feel like it's, there's the term virtue signaling. It's literally a sign. But like in this time where we're pretty limited in how we can put our bodies in places for our neighbors, like perhaps that is for us like a way to be held accountable, especially for some of us who are awakening in a new way to something many communities have known and has been going on for a long time. I think that the test will be, how old how old and faded those yard signs are allowed to get, and what happens after there's a vaccine and all of these things. Yeah, I guess that's been an interesting development in, seeing some of these really nice big houses in our neighborhood that is, turning over and renewing and gentrifying in good and bad ways, and to see this sort of like sign activism. But like I'm curious. I guess I'm curious mostly of like, okay, now what, and like I'm also excited for some of those signs that I see that are like made by children, because like I'm really curious, like, okay, what long-term impact, like what kind of, in some ways, like catechism is happening here, so I guess that's kind of carrying on the thread of holding protest and church next to each other as kind of not even just parallel things, but kind of interactive modes of witness. And I think there's certainly some problems with that in ways that, and we've kind of alluded that activism becomes its own sort of religious expression, but yeah.
I think that's great that you brought that up there. I actually talk about yard signs like a few times in The Myth of the American Dream, and near the end there's like a little chapter about my sort of ambivalence about having one of those signs that says, no matter where you're from, I'm glad you're my neighbor, in like Spanish and Arabic and English. And I actually have a lot of Spanish speaking and Arabic speaking neighbors. So I was like, this is great.
They
But
never have those signs though, do they?
well, I mean, I got it. No, they don't. You're right. They don't put up those signs.
Right.
But I did. And again, our neighborhood is really interesting because there's a lot of like older white homeowners who moved out here to escape the diversity of Portland, and then all these people of poverty, including immigrants and refugees. And actually, a lot of people from North Portland got pushed out to Rockwood. And so there's now a lot of people of color living in apartments, all this stuff. And there's some real huge tensions. The white homeowners fly Confederate flags in Portland, Oregon.
Mm.
So I put up my sign and it's been run over 3 times. It has been stolen. And so I was just like, I'm just going to keep buying it, but like after 2 times, I think I was like, is this just virtue signaling? Is this also, it's obviously making white neighbors mad. So is that a good thing, a bad thing, And then my neighbor across the street finally came over to me one day, and he is Spanish speaking. And he was like, so did you just get tired of your sign? I was like, no, it got stolen a few times, blah, blah. He's like, well, when you put that up, I knew you were okay to talk to. I was like,
Oh.
oh, so it actually did, some of these little things we do, even if we're misguided, even if it's not perfect, they can be little flares to
Mhm.
let people know that you're safe. I am tired of replacing it with people vandalizing it. And the last one got so beat up. Ugh. But we just went and put a Black Lives Matter sign up, so we'll see how long that lasts. I'm very curious. The neighbors behind me just put up a ginormous flagpole with the American flag right next to our property and like have a spotlight on it, so it's like always shining, which I find very aggressive. But sorry, this is really long-winded, but I just want to say today, as we were taking our little daily walking back to our house, right in front of our Black Lives Matter sign, and sort of near our mailbox is a like neighborhood, like here's a speed limit sign, and it has this neighborhood watch sign, right, which shows this like really shifty looking guy like with a
With the
hat and
eyeball.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, it's not, yeah, I've posted pictures of it before because I always pay attention to that sign. This is a
Okay.
part of my paying attention to the neighborhood, blah blah blah. And I'm like, it says, we won't hesitate to call the police on you. And so my 5-year-old son was like, what does that sign mean? And I read it to him, and then my daughter's like, oh yeah, but we won't call the police. I was like, no, we won't. And because we've been talking about this, and we had this whole conversation about the fact that like we know all of our neighbors, and they check in with us all the time. Like
Yeah.
the same neighbor I mentioned who said, I felt safe when you put up that sign. Like if there's a car parked too long in front of our house, he'll be like, hey, you know those people? You okay?
Mm.
And like we've
Yeah.
all got each other's back because we know each other. Like we're not calling the police. Like we are looking out for each other because that's what neighbors do. And that is what makes a safe community. Not this sign that says we're going to call the police on a suspicious looking person in our neighborhood. If it's somebody we don't know, we will check in with each other. Like, do you know these people? Like there's people trying to break into cars. Do you know those people? Like we just ask each other. So all this is, I think signage is really important. Pay attention to those signs in what neighborhoods that say we're watching you and we'll call the police. And then pay attention to like, how could we actually visibly tell our neighbors like that's not how we're going to live. And it takes more than a sign, right? You got to actually talk to people, but sometimes they could be a little bit helpful.
Anything that you want to share that seems very necessary, or you would be upset if we didn't talk about?
I feel great about this. I maybe want to circle back to kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, where I'd experienced, I didn't really understand the lack of diversity in Portland until I left. And Liz, you were saying like it wasn't until you went to New York that you were really able to also recognize some things. And so maybe that's just like a general word for all of us right now. And maybe specifically more for, again, people who come from a privileged or dominant background, that we are going to need to be able to step back a little bit to really experience some of these myths that drive our lives away from the life of Jesus Christ. Because when you're in the thick of it, it's really hard to see, and it takes diverse voices. It's taken my neighbors, right? It's taken experiencing other cities, other cultures, other religions, all of this to help me see my own background more clearly and to be able to grapple with the complexities of it. And so maybe that's just a good word for all of us. Sometimes it feels overwhelming. Like, some people are like, all you do is say the white Americans are bad or something. And that's not what I'm saying, but it deserves scrutiny, and we need the global historical church like to move forward for God's dream for the world. It has to be bigger than white American evangelicals. It has to be, and thank goodness it is. And that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Amen. Well, thanks for being with us today, Liz and Danielle. Danielle's book is The Myth of the American Dream, Reflections on Affluence, Autonomy, Safety, and Power from Ivy Press, out this year and available anywhere where you get your books.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Thanks for saying yes.
Yeah. I've got the joy of the Lord down in my soul. Down in my soul. And I've got the joy of the Lord down in my soul. Down in my soul. It's so good. It's so good. I won't let it go. And it's so good. It's so good. Won't let it go. Y'all like that? Help me out. Say that I've got the joy of the Lord down in my soul. Down in my soul. Down in my soul. Down in my soul. Help me out, right? And I've got the joy of the Lord down in my soul. Down in my soul. Said I got it way down in my soul. Down in my soul. Hey, and it's so good. It's so good. I won't let it go. And it's so good. It's so good. What about it? Won't let it go. Yeah. Real quiet. I've got the peace of the Lord that I can't explain. I can't explain. In spite of my circumstances, I can't explain it. I can't explain. Oh, hey. And I've got the peace of the Lord that I can't explain. I can't explain. Ooh, I can't explain it. I can't explain. Yeah, and it's so good. It's so good. I won't let it go. It's so good. It's so good. What about it? Won't let it go. Yeah.
You just spent more than an hour of your day listening to this conversation, and for that we're grateful. We'd love to continue the conversation by social media, so you can contact us at Bob Crawford Base, at RevBrez, or through the show's social media at RTN Theology. We'd love to hear the ways that you're experiencing these conversations, the ways that you're sharing them and sparking new conversations, the ways that you're building community, and any ideas you might have for future guests or topics. If you enjoyed this episode with D.L. Mayfield, you might enjoy going back through some of the older episodes, like episode 20 with author Amy Peterson and her book, Where Goodness Still Grows, or some of our recent episodes, like the two-part episode with Liz Vice and Micah Bournet called Fight Evil with Poetry. That's episode 28, part 1 and 2. Or last episode number 29 with Natalie Carnes and James K.A. Smith on Augustine. RTN Theology is produced by Chris Breslin and Bob Crawford, and this episode was hosted by Liz Vice and Chris Breslin, and I edited it. Special music for this episode came from Common Hymnal. Many thanks to Brittany Spencer and the rest of that crew. You heard The Cross Made the Change, The Kingdom is Yours, Rose Petals, and I've Got the Joy. Check out their stuff on commonhymnal.com. You can stream it or buy it wherever you get your music. You can also listen to their podcast.
Our intro music is A.A. Gray and 7 Foot Dilly. The old ark's a-movin'. And we love to end our show with David Childers' Jesus Said. Please remember to rate us on iTunes and write a review, subscribe to our podcast, and follow us on socials. And please, please, please share this episode with a friend. Until next time, take care.